Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. So a quick intro of myself. My name is Jumoke Abdullah. I'm one half of the Cripples, which is a platform and organization that I co-founded along with my magnificent other half, Kim Oliver, where we look at the people, so disabled women, femmes, and non-binary people of color that live life with disabilities. So that's what we're all about. And if everybody can introduce themselves, if I could start with Maya, please.
Hello, my name is Maya, and I am the host and creator and producer of Proud Stutter. It's a podcast about shifting the narrative around stuttering, speech differences, and embracing all forms of verbal diversity. I'm based in San Francisco, California. Podcasting is a hobby that's quickly becoming a little more than that. And yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Super, thank you. Lydia?
Hi, my name's Lydia. Usually I'm a freelance journalist. However, this went into podcasting because I podcast for Conscious Being magazine, which is a magazine I'm a staff writer for. Conscious Being is for disabled women and non-binary individuals, and the idea was to kind of capture disability in all its kind of like the full spectrum, rather than just having the stereotypes about, that it's just people of a older age, for example, because disability can be about everyone, and also we can, we still enjoy books and sex, dating, whatever, and that kind of thing. My debut book, The Autism Friendly Cookbook, I'm also autistic, is out in November later this year.
Great, thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, Natasha.
Hi, I'm Natasha Lipman. I am the host of the Restroom podcast, and I also write on Substack under the Restroom. I am a journalist. I left the BBC in January, and I am particularly interested in working with experts in the field of disability and chronic illness to help people learn different ways about managing chronic illness and a lot of that information that people just do not have access to.
Right, wonderful. Thank you all so much for introducing yourselves. So today we're going to be talking about podcasting and accessibility and what that looks like and what that could potentially be, and what are the different tools, etc., that we could utilize beyond the transcript. So Natasha, if you could kind of like talk to us a little bit about what you not only enjoy about podcasting, but what could also make it more accessible, not just for you, but also other people.
It's quite funny, actually, because I'm a writer first and foremost, and I like to write very long things. And I know for a lot of people, that's not particularly accessible. So initially, I started a podcast as a way of making my very, very long articles more accessible for people by reading them. And it was something that I really enjoyed doing. And I started thinking about how I could craft podcasts and articles together. And I just really, over time, thought about how can I create a podcast where I have the time and space to explore the issues that I think are particularly interesting in a different format. This kind of was also happening at the time that I was finding it really, really hard to write. I would just stare at a screen and nothing would come out, and I can talk for days. So it was a kind of a strange identity crisis because that sounds a bit dramatic. It wasn't actually like that, but I am a writer first and foremost, and so trying to find that balance with being able to produce work and produce things that I had in my head was quite challenging. I started working with producers in September, and that for me was a complete game changer because I realistically didn't have the skills or the energy to be able to do the entire podcast process myself. And I wasn't able to produce the type of content at the quality that I wanted to by myself. And I think for people in the chronic illness space, listening to podcasts can be something that is very accessible to them. They don't have to watch everything in one go. They can press pause when they need to. I, of course, make transcripts available, so I try and kind of cover a lot of those bases. What has been a challenge for me is having producers realistically is an accessibility need for me. I could do this myself. It would just take a lot longer, and I don't have the energy to be able to do that. So for me, one of the really big issues is financial. I can't do the transcripts myself because that's a huge amount of time. I have to outsource that. I have to outsource working with producers. And so trying to find ways to make the type of content I want also financially sustainable in terms of just at base level covering my costs, and then trying to make a living out of this, because there are so many things that I want to do with my podcast, but if I can't justify the time that I'm taking away from working because I can't work full time, that's something that's been really challenging to try and figure out.
Thank you so much. Maya, how about you? What does accessibility look like in audio, and like what's your dream scenario, you know, especially with somebody with you know, that's verbally diverse?
Yeah, as a woman who stutters, and you know, just drawing from my own experiences as someone who identifies as having an invisible disability, accessibility in audio, I think really looks like just always trying to educate yourself, because you know, it's hard to like be an expert about everything disability, because disability, it's also such a personal experience. And so for me and stuttering, my speech disability, it's very misunderstood. And that is mostly because stuttering is not often seen in popular culture, like TV, film, and the media, and it's not often talked about. And so I think, you know, asking simple questions in the beginning of first meeting someone or working with someone, do you have any accessibility needs? Because that just opens up the space for people to either open up about their disability or not. There are, like stuttering, in my case, it's very inconsistent. So I often appear fluent in a lot of situations, but if I have the space to open up, to take the pressure off myself, to always wanting to sound fluent and just disclosing right up front that I have a stutter, it really helps just make that space comfortable for me. And so I think this can apply to the podcasting industry and really any industry. Similar how we use our pronouns, that's a very normalized thing now. I think we could also normalize what is your accessibility needs, and that just, you know, creates that space right off the bat. And also, I just wanted to say on top of Natasha's comment that, you know, I'm an independent podcaster. I do everything myself. I put all of my money into this podcast. It was originally just going to be one season, but so many people asked me to keep going that I'm just going to keep trying to put my money into it and just make it as sustainable as possible. But it's exhausting to do every part of the process. It's a lot of time, especially when you want to meet those accessibility needs that our listeners deserve. It's very hard. And I wish there was more opportunities for voices like us to tap into more resources to support our art.
Thank you so much. And yes, absolutely agreed. I know within my working life, whenever we have team meetings, one of the first questions that we ask is like, does anybody have any access needs? Not only does that allow people to understand that this is a safe space, you know, should you want to disclose that you can, and it's just somewhere more like comforting and comfortable. It's the onus isn't on the person, but rather, you know, kind of like those that are within the power structures that have the ability to change things are the ones that, hey, we're asking you, let's normalize this, let's make this regular. And Lydia, yes, what does accessibility in audio look like to you?
I just want to follow up in terms of what's been said in terms of the access needs. This is so interesting just because so I am on the autistic spectrum. but I don't specifically my podcast is not about autism. It is about disabilities in general. Each episode has a particular theme as kind of like a debrief, hence the name, the Disabled Debrief. You can listen and it's quick and it tells you about disability quickly. I don't think I've maybe been on one podcast as a guest where I've ever been asked what my access needs were. I've always had to ask in terms of can I have the podcast structure and the questions first? Which is so, I love that that's been brought up, because the thing is with my guests, I always say, is there anything I can do in terms of like your access needs? I will give you the Zoom link. Natasha knows this because strangely enough, we are recording an episode tomorrow. I send the questions ahead of time. When it comes to me personally, in terms of listening to an episode, because I have kind of like hypersensitivity issues related to being on the spectrum, I find it very difficult when podcasts are overproduced. So when you can have the voice and then you have the music and then you have all this. And very often as well, so because everyone is podcasting from their computer, podcasts don't get very good edits sometimes. And that sounds like a really horrible thing to say and quite controversial, but the background noise, if you've not recorded it properly, at least limiting, it can be absolutely unbearable to listen to all of the background noise and the overproduction. Like, nothing's been done about this. It's even things like if you record with Bluetooth headphones, the noise of the Bluetooth that your podcasting recording equipment picks up, that's so annoying. Like, why would you do that? To be accessible, I need a podcast that has a clean audio to actually engage with it. And I also think as well, for people who are autistic and non-verbal, there is not a lot of podcasting content with them. So often people would use, I think it's called an AAC device, where they have the keyboard and they type to create the audio sound rather than speaking. There's hardly anything like that. But I would like to hear more, because that's so very often not tapped into and it's not even taken into consideration.
Thank you so much, Lydia. A point that had been brought up, I believe, by both Maya and Natasha, and I guess in a way, Lydia, is when we're talking about accessibility and inclusivity, we also have to look at the financial side of it, like all of these productions and all of these equipments and tools that would certainly make life easy. Unfortunately, they're not free and they're certainly not cheap. What would you like to see in terms of the financial side of like audio production and accessibility? Like, what do we think can be done? Is there anybody that's out there doing something right now? Is there a way that we can perhaps, I don't know, get sponsorship of some of these creators of these tools to say like, hey, we will, put some money behind this, or we will give you this equipment, just to ensure that accessibility is at the forefront of what they're doing. And this is Oh, Lydia, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm so sorry. There's a slight delay on my the way you phrased it. I thought you were talking to me. I'm so sorry. There is a person I know. I'm not going to identify her because she's not launched this podcast yet. She is also on the autistic spectrum, but the way she has a very different business model from a lot of podcasters I know. And the way she's gone about that is to sponsor the equipment in order for her to podcast. Does that make sense? You can take basic precautions, but in terms of kind of like accessibility, I think it starts by just asking the question what your access needs are. Like, people often think in terms of accessibility, oh my God, it's so expensive. Very often it's not always. Like, it can just be at a very base level sometimes.
Yeah, when you said that your friend had sponsored the equipment, what does that mean?
So I'm trying to think of a way to phrase this to not identify her too much. She's working with it's the way in which she's put this is to a brand to say, okay, I'd like the podcast equipment to work with you. Here's a project I'm making. Would you be interested in sponsoring me? in return for XYZ.
Right. Okay. So they're not actually sponsoring themselves with money out of their own pocket. That's what I wanted to ask.
No, but they're given.
Oh no, I mean it's okay. Like we don't want to identify it. It's just the way that it was phrased. I was like, the issue is the finances. But if
Sorry.
well, it's okay. If they're getting it sponsored, that's. Does anybody else want to? Yep, Natasha.
Yeah, I think one of the big things when we talk about audio accessibility is transcripts. And I'm actually someone that doesn't listen to a huge amount of audio. I take in information better reading, and I'm also much quicker at reading than at listening. So making transcripts available is something that's really important. But I know this from my days as a journalist. Writing transcripts is a really time-consuming job. We've got lots of nodding going on here. And even if you can use transcription software, something like Otter, for example, if you want to make an accurate transcription, depending on the accent, depending on how people are speaking, it can be really difficult for those auto transcription services to give you clean copy. So I often ended up spending hours and hours and hours correcting the auto transcription. I now use a transcription service where I pay for that, but it's relatively inexpensive compared to a lot of other options. I think it's on Rev. And so it ends up costing about £30 or £40 an episode for the transcription. And I usually get it all back within a few hours. I have to read and listen to it over again, but usually it's like 98% accurate or something. So in terms of time save, that's something that has been really, really important. And it makes sure that I can provide a transcript for people. But one of the challenges with that is, not only is it an extra cost on every episode, it's also a lot of extra time. If you can't afford to get someone to transcribe for you, you have to spend hours and hours and hours going over your audio and writing it out. Even if you do have it transcribed and you want to listen over, that's still, X amount of time extra. And if you do have an energy limiting condition, these are all things that are taking away from your ability to do other things, or you might be choosing to do this, which is completely fine. It's what you're choosing to spend your energy on, but it's all this extra time that keeps getting added onto the podcast production schedule. So I would just like good transcription to be available for free. It is baffling to me that this is still not available when this technology exists, at least for the base level of this. And it's very surprising how many big podcasts that are obviously making a lot of money based on their sponsors are not providing transcripts for their podcasts. And it's often on the people with the smaller podcasts who are putting in this accessibility and are paying for it out of pocket.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And for transcripts, when I first started doing my own transcripts for a Proud Stutter, I would go over the audio and put in every time my guests and I would stutter. So that like took so much time because I wanted to be as authentic as possible and really represent in the transcript stuttering. So it's just, it's not just in the audio, but it's also in the transcript. But that got way too labor intensive, and I can't really afford to hire someone to do transcripts because including all the stuttering, it does take a lot of extra time and it's a little more expensive. And so I'm trying to figure out that balance and finding a tool that I can afford that catches all the ums and the blocks and the stuttering, because there's a lot of transcription tools that are very clean, like they cut out the ums right away and the likes. But as people who stutter, we use those phrases a lot as part of our stuttering. And so I'm really trying to find a transcription tool that can capture all that. And this happened to me just like last week, but someone reached out to me offering to remove my ums, pauses, and repeated words in my podcast as like a service. And I got so offended. Like, did they even read about my show and how it's all about stuttering? And that's exactly why I'm doing it in the first place. So that note just made me realize we kind of have a long way to go when it comes to understanding neurodiversity and verbal diversity, and how our industry just can be more inclusive of all different types of speech.
It's quite interesting because in many ways that's the opposite of what I tell to a lot of my guests, because we have a lot of people with brain fog who might have a thought, their brain goes completely blank, and then they can't figure out what they were saying for a minute or two. So something I always say to people is, we do pre-record this, we can edit things out. If you need to go back, if you need to say it again, I even say to people, if a week later you realize you completely need to rephrase something, we can jump back on. We do things in advance that give people the ability, if they're having a bit of a difficult time with their brain on any given day and they don't feel that they can say what they want to say in the most representative way, I think that's really great. It just reminded me, actually, I did an event with Welcome last year, I think it was, and we pre-recorded this conversation, and then on the day that it came out, we were in a it was a chat room as part of the online presentation, and we were able to share our thoughts about what we've been talking about in the chat and engage with other people. And I realized as I was watching, I could have phrased this thing better. And it enabled me to kind of go in and give a bit more context to what I was saying, or be able to expand on what I was saying afterwards. Because often when I talk, I forget what I say, and then I listen to something, I'm like, oh, okay, I have no idea what came out of my mouth at that point. And being able to kind of go in afterwards was a really interesting experience in terms of just helping me feel like I had represented myself in the best way at that time. And I think that's something that's quite interesting for people who struggle with something like brain fog.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Actually, that leads us into my next question. When we consider the challenges of podcasting and creating a podcast with, excuse me, verbal diversity, with a chronic illness. So how do we consider things like consistency? Because if you have a condition, for example, that fluctuates, so it's like every other Tuesday, we're going to have a new episode of the Proud Stutter or a new episode of the Rest Room, but then your body's just like, nope, absolutely not. Like, how do you at least try and work that within the schedules that you have, that's not also greatly and negatively impacting your body's need for rest, and to be able to just back off for a bit, if it's for an hour or even for a week or a month? Open to weather. Yeah. Sorry.
I actually block record ahead of time usually. So when it comes to when putting out the first, I kind of learned with the first season of the Disabled Debrief to not be it was a little bit, it was just mad. So in terms of having to, I would be like, okay, here is an episode I recorded, and I've got to get it for this week, and then I've got to edit, and then I was doing it on the week it was going out. That was stressful, and I learned a very valuable lesson. So now what I tend to do is, for series 2, I had this will be in 2 parts, because so currently I'm having to manage post-COVID symptoms. So there'll be a week break in between. I'm block recording and block editing, just so I can still put them out, but rest in between, just as and it also works well in terms of guests and their access needs as well, I found.
One of the things that I think also is quite challenging when we're talking about this is expectations from the audience. Mm-hmm. If you look at any piece of advice on how to be a good blogger, how to be a good Instagrammer, how to be a good podcaster, the number one thing people say is consistency, and the audience expects consistency. And so that means that we as creators feel like we have to be consistent no matter how we're feeling. And so I think it's a bit of a two-way street in terms of audience expectation and what creators can do. I actually, because I work with producers, that's taken a huge amount of the time pressure off for me, because I can basically outsource a lot of that work, and it does enable me to produce things more regularly. The problem that I'm having is finding sponsors regularly enough that will cover my production costs. So I actually have episodes that are ready, but I'm waiting for a sponsor so that my costs can be covered because of that help that I need, because I can't put all of that time in to creating something by myself. So it's something that I actually spend a huge amount of time trying to find the funding, and I don't really know where to go for that. And I will say that I'm fortunate that I had a platform on social media beforehand, so that has helped me be able to get sponsors for my podcast. And it was going really, really well, and I was like bringing things out very consistently. And it slowed down a little bit, which is a bit difficult. So I have things that I want to put out, but I can't afford to put them out yet. I have been thinking about maybe working in seasons, so I can have themed seasons or work on something specific and then just make sure all the funding is there up front. Because at this point as well, I spent maybe 6-7 years doing what I do as a side thing. And now I'm trying to make it my job, which means that financial side is really important to think about as well, that it's not just costs are covered, that my time is covered, because I think we so often do not include our time and the effort and the energy that we put into this work as part of our costings for this, because we think that this work is important and we want to help people and we want to put those things out there. But it's really important that we think about our time as well. So again, that can also be challenging if your income is then dependent on having a regular schedule. So I don't have all the answers to it, but those are just some of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of regularity in podcasting recently.
Maya, do you want to add something, or shall I?
Yeah, just quickly, I decided very early before I launched my podcast that I wanted to do seasons, because I knew, I wanted to have that break. And when I started a Proud Stutter, I started it with one of my best friends who doesn't stutter herself. And so we really helped each other, stay on schedule. And if she wasn't feeling well, we kind of like tagged a team on that stuff. And we always recorded on Monday, and we always made sure we were a few weeks ahead in case like we had a really busy week at our full-time jobs. And so we started really ahead of time and and our Monday nights were just always for recording. So that helped us kind of get into a groove. We just finished our first season, and now I'm in my hiatus, and it's been a really kind of less stressful time because I'm not on this consistent schedule of always having to get an episode out, and I'm able to experiment and see what kind of episodes and bonus episodes can work for my next season. And so I think that's just been a very nice system that has worked for me when it comes to consistency.
Can I add one more thing, if that's okay?
Yes, of course.
One of the aspects of podcasting that we all need to take into consideration is community building and getting ears on the episode. So in terms of time that goes into that, it's not only the work that we do on the episodes itself, it's also all of that time that needs to go into community building and spending time on social media and interacting with the audience. And that in and of itself is hugely, hugely time consuming, especially if you are dependent on social media platforms that change all the time and then you don't really like the changes that they make. I'm not going to go into a rant about that Instagram. Anyway.
Yes, our favorite platform, and the ever-changing algorithm. So we've touched upon kind of like consistency and working with certain limitations that our body might bring about in terms of like environment, etc., and building a community, kind of like speaking with your audience. So when we're trying to balance the podcast that we've put our all and our energy into, but then also being cognizant and kind to the fact that sometimes our bodies might need a rest, we might need a bit of a time off. How much of yourself and your conditions, disabilities do you actually put out there within your podcast? Or is it a case of, oh, usually there'd be an episode on this Wednesday, but it's not happening because my spoons just aren't there? Have you developed those kinds of relationships with your audiences where they're like, oh, I know what's going on? Or do you keep a bit of that, a bit of yourself to yourself and just say, I'll get back to you when I can. Like, how do you balance the two? If you could start us off, Natasha.
I'm not always the kindest to myself, and I'm trying to learn to do that, which is funny because I do a lot of podcasts about how to pace. But I also talk about how I find it very difficult. So it's not hypocritical to say that sometimes I push myself a bit too far. I also launched a Substack newsletter. So I think I might have overpromised with my Substack what I can deliver. So I'm trying to find ways that are less intense. And so I do write about the more personal things on there. And then when it comes to the podcast itself, I try and bring elements of my life that can highlight certain things that we are bringing in from some of the medical professionals, because I think it's really helpful to bring examples. But I kind of have a line in my head and I don't know how to describe it about how much I do share. Like, I want to share enough that it can be helpfully illustrative, without feeling like I have to put my entire life on social media. And that's, I think, partially why I moved away from Instagram quite a long time ago, because it was like this constant feeling of pressure to almost perform, like, oh, I did this and now I feel really bad, and oh, I did this and now I have to recover. And it was just like, in order to feel like you were being transparent, you almost had to like perform online, and I didn't find that particularly healthy, and I didn't like it. So I try and be realistic about what I can and can't do. But when it comes to the podcast, I have never said that like I am releasing, at least I don't think I've said, in my head I haven't said that I am releasing an episode every day or every week at this time. So the podcasts are nice surprises when they come out, which obviously would change if I had a season of things. But yeah, it's a really difficult one, and I've definitely pushed myself too much to get something out, but I've realized that these deadlines are completely arbitrary. Unless I have a signed contract with someone that says I have something that needs to come out on a certain day, which usually those are negotiable anyway. I think we put a lot of external pressure on ourselves, but I never notice when a podcast I subscribe to doesn't release an episode. But maybe because I don't wait for an episode to come out that I'm going to listen to at a certain time every day. So again, it comes down to audience expectation as well as our own expectations about what we can produce.
Yeah, and I guess sometimes you can, what happens for me, at least I know, it's like, it's like, take care of yourself, Natasha, do what's right for you, Maya. But then when it's me, it's like, no, you have to do it. You have to do this. And you're like your own harshest critic. And it's just kind of like, do you speak to your friend this way? No, then cut it out. Right, Lydia, how do you balance the two, if there's ever been a need?
Not well, in short. It's sort of so in terms of kind of the deadlines, I actually found it quite useful. So as an autistic person, I struggle in terms of kind of like executive functioning and therefore sequencing and editing. I found it quite useful, but when it came to the first season that I produced for Conscious Being, there was a period where I think it was about 3 weeks where it just was not possible. I was on a book deadline and there was way too much to do. Like, I was overwhelmed. And it kind of struck me that just nobody cared. Like, nobody asked where the podcast was or anything. Not even my wonderful editor. She didn't even ask me where this was. That being said, when it comes to this, is just, I love what we're saying about consistency. There was a wonderful journalist who was interested in making a podcast of their newsletter. I'm not going to identify them because they would be cross if I said this. But the newsletter is, the part of the newsletter is that it's irregular and unruly content. It's true crime. And I would like to see, in terms of the business model, how that would work in terms of irregular episodes, just because every single podcast I've ever seen has always been like, for this such and such a time, we will consistently build this. But I'm wondering, in terms of kind of like access and like managing, if we did it irregularly enough, whether that would work. However, I think you would have to have a big enough platform.
Yeah. And Maya, have you ever had to kind of like balance what our audience expectations and what the audience is, looking to from Proud Stutter, as well as, what your needs are in the creation of your podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still learning. I have only done one season, which was 13 episodes, and my podcast, it's very niche. And so like I do have a pretty engaged listenership, which is amazing. But yeah, like similar to what Natasha said, like I am not very kind to myself. Like I'm always thinking about my listener, and I really view like my listeners and my Proud Stutter community as family. And so when I don't meet a certain deadline I have for myself, I'm just like, I honestly feel like I'm letting my family down, and I'm letting all those people out there who need me. And I don't know, I just have this like whole like emotional thing because I'm so like attached to like my listeners. And so the one time when I had to extend my show a week because I wasn't able to get an episode out on a time, I did get a few notes saying, oh, where's the episode? And so that made me realize that I needed to kind of step it up. And National Stuttering Awareness Week was a few weeks ago, and that is like the most exhausted I've ever felt in my life, because I was just like, go, go, go. And I have a full-time job. And so I was doing National Stuttering Awareness Week stuff like in the morning and at night. And then I got COVID a week after. So it's like, that was a wake-up call that like I really needed to slow down and really take advantage of this break period. And just my listeners will understand. And not all of my listeners are on social media, so sometimes I can't update everyone of where I am or like what's happening, what's going on personally. And so that's always in the back of my head, like how do I reach my listeners? But yeah, it's a balance, and I'm learning to really try to take care of myself along the way.
I think it's interesting if you're thinking about an audience of people who have energy limiting chronic illnesses or disabilities, though, because if you're putting out too much content, they might not be able to keep up. So another thing that I've thought about is if I have episodes that are very long, we split them in half sometimes. So we have part 1 and we have part 2, and that gives me 2 pieces of content for the same amount of work. And we can kind of spread that out, and it gives my audience time to think and kind of come to terms with the last piece of content. So I think maybe that might help us give ourselves a bit of a break if we realize that if we have an audience who can't take in too much info. I can't keep up with all the podcasts I listen to. I had podcasts from 2 years ago that I haven't listened to. So I think there is a really fine balance between not enough, or what we deem to not be enough, and too much.
Can I ask a question about that? Do you find that the longer a podcast episode is, if you look at the analytics for an episode, the attention and the I forget what it's called. Ironically enough, I still have brain fog from having COVID, just ever so slightly. And the list, what's the word for how long a episode is listened for?
Like retention?
Yeah. Do you find that the longer it is, it just drops dramatically?
So I'm on Substack now, and they don't give you that detailed information.
Oh, right.
I don't even think about that at the moment.
It's just so interesting that you were saying that, because so in terms of, I remember when this makes you sound so obnoxious, but when podcasts sort of exploded, everyone was like, oh yes, true crime, long episodes and all that sort of thing. But now it seems to me that the attention span has kind of changed, not just in terms of disabilities, but kind of like everyone. So if a podcast is longer than, say, like 20 minutes, it just drops off.
Data on that?
I don't have data on that, but from my own personal experience, my attention span absolutely is not what it should be. Like I'll see on any social media, like I'll see a video And let's say instead of being like 30 seconds long, it's saying like 7 minutes. And I'm like, my attention span has gone completely down the toilet. And I don't know what that is, maybe because everyone's just kind of like so quick and so instant nowadays. But I mean, it's really useful knowing that if you have, you know, like you said, Natasha, this large or long piece of content, you know, this long podcast episode, that, you know, you can, you know, chop it up and you can, I guess, in a way, tease it as well. So you get multiple uses out of the exact same level of work. You know, the transcription is already there, like the everything has been done. It's just in how many chunks that you put it out. Yeah. Okay, so next question. Can we have, if you've got them, good examples of accessible podcasts? Feel free to name your own, by the way, big yourselves up.
I used to really like Media Masters. I know that it's not disability specific, but in terms of the way it was run and in terms of, so the audio was very clear, there were transcripts and all sorts of other things. I must admit, I do feel a little bit of a hypocrite, I will say. So currently my podcast doesn't have a transcript due to we've had quite a dramatic shift in terms of kind of like staff and working and all that sort of thing, and I'm still sick from COVID. I feel absolutely terrible to admit that. Yeah, so I just, in terms of access, I feel kind of hypocritical answering this. I do really like the rest of them as well. That's Natasha. It's also the illustrator for my book has a wonderful podcast. It's called 21 and Sensory, and it's sort of like when it comes to sound, everything is just the world is too loud to me as an autistic person. But listening to Emily's podcast, it's wonderful because it's kind of like the world around us but muted. It sounds really silly to say, but it's just so nice to listen to. It's so clean in terms of the audio. She edits well, and all the questions are so engaging.
Okay, wonderful. We like clean, engaging podcasts. Maya, how about you?
Yeah, so before I started Proud Stutter, I really didn't feel like I could do a podcast with my stutter. Like, it was actually a dream of mine to be a journalist when I was really young, and I just never thought I could do it because of my stutter. And so when I first heard, one of the first podcasts I ever listened to was NPR's Life Kit. I don't know if you guys have heard of it, but what I really liked about it is they invited experts on the show, and the show is like, each episode is about a different topic, like how to host a dinner party, or how to you know, hang up art in your house, you know, just like all these random stuff, or like how to get rid of your, I don't know, just like random life stuff. And what I really liked about the podcast is they invited experts that had speech differences, and those people, like, they were just on as themselves. They weren't even talking about their disability. It was just simply them being themselves and talking about what they're an expert in. And I just love the ease of it. And it made me realize, like, after listening to those episodes, that I could too do my own podcast with a stutter. And so I ended up reaching out to the producers there, Megan Keane and Sylvia Douglas. And I was just gushing about how inspirational their podcast was, because a lot of people, they talk the talk, but these women walk the walk. They really practice what it means to be an inclusive show. And so, yeah, I very much recommend listening to their show for that reason.
Something that I learned quite quickly is that I'm never going to know everything about accessibility. what's accessible to me might be inaccessible to someone else. And that's an interesting question. How do you navigate people with conflicting access needs? And there are so many elements of accessibility that I'm still reading about and still learning about. And I think just for anyone here who doesn't work in the accessibility space, I think it's okay if you feel overwhelmed, because I feel overwhelmed by it as well. And trying to figure out what we can do and trying to understand all of those things. So yeah, I interviewed Carrie Ann Lightly, who works at Access Able a while ago. Yes, Carrie Ann, specifically about why there's no such thing as fully accessible, because accessibility needs are so varying. Every one of us here will have different accessibility needs. So I think if you're working with individuals, as everyone has already said, ask them what is accessible to them, reach out to your audience and see what you can do. As for some people, having any audio, any music in a podcast might not be accessible. So there's so many different things to consider there.
Great, thank you so much for that point, Natasha. It brings me to the next question of, what do you want those within the industry to know and to understand when developing tools and systems, to support you? Because oftentimes, let's say somebody is listening to this podcast that we're recording now, it's like, oh, light bulb moment, I've got something that'll sort this out. But they don't, like you said, engage with the audience, ask the questions like, what do you, Natasha, actually need? What do you, Lydia, actually need? What would make your life easier listening to a podcast, Maya, or creating a podcast? So starting with Maya, if you could just say one thing. Am I putting you on the spot, Maya? You ready?
No, I am ready. I have an example.
Oh, wonderful. We love examples. But yeah, what do you want them to understand when these tools and systems are being created?
Yeah, so I have a very specific example that I found extremely offensive, and I'm trying not to be like too emotional about it, because I know that stuttering is still very misunderstood and people just don't know a lot about it. So this is nothing personal, but I think it's very careful, because I think people that are marketing their tools for audio, they need to be very careful, especially when it comes to the stuttering community. For example, there's this new tool called Clean Voice, which already has a ton of problems with the name. And what I found offensive about it is, on the homepage, it says, although your content may be great, if the listening experience is poor, people are likely to tune out. We analyze various factors like stuttering to determine a score. And so, yeah, I think that just really made me just really, I guess, afraid for the podcasting industry, and it just makes me want to just be out there even more, because that is not okay. And if someone who stuttered saw that might really affect them. And so yeah, that's just one example I wanted to call out in the marketing of tools, because yes, we want our sound to sound good, but just because someone stutters, it doesn't mean it's not a listenable podcast. And my show is one example, because like for editing, I'm very careful. I try to balance making it listenable and also being very authentic with my guests. And so there is a way to do it. And we shouldn't label stuttering as a negative.
Quite right too. I mean, that is really awful, and I'm sorry to hear that. I would never dream if somebody had a disability which meant that, like, they coughed a lot or they made a particular noise, you wouldn't edit it out, because that's them in terms of their authentic experience. Why on earth is what you described as acceptable? That's just awful. it's stuttering is, as you say, listenable. That's terrible.
Yeah, so sorry that you experienced that, Maya. And I think it kind of speaks to the fact that people need to understand that disability has a myriad of kind of like presentations, what people consider to be differences, conditions, disabilities, etc. Like it needs to be widened so much more because disability is still thought of in the very narrow view of physical mobility. So your wheelchairs, your crutches, etc. And we have to expand our minds and actually realize that there's a huge depth and breadth of diversity, of difference. And, you know, they're all very valid and they're just different ways of being. And that should also be represented and catered for and highlighted and celebrated within podcasting as well as everywhere else. Natasha, do you have any examples for us?
I would like better integration of transcription into publishing platforms, and also good free transcription services that are fully integrated, so that we can ensure that that is accessible for people who need it.
Yeah, you mentioned my favorite price, free, so many times.
Yes.
I wanted to, like, I have, like, we've got episodes of the Triple Cripples where I'm like, oh my God, I can't wait for the people to hear this. And then I'll see how long it is. And I'm like, oh, I'm going to get back to this later because it takes so much, you know. And if we think of accessibility and inclusivity, we absolutely have to include the numbers into it. We have to include the finances because you could do all of these amazing things, but if you can't afford to put it out, what happens then, you know?
And you can spend longer transcribing the episode than it takes you to record it.
Yes. I'll speak for an hour and then it'll take me a week to transcribe it because I'm like, wait, what did I say? And sometimes I don't even understand myself. I'm like, well, that's a problem. So yeah. Lydia, is there anything else that you'd like to include when different tools and systems are being created? What would you like the creators to think about and consider?
When it comes to editing, I would like people to understand that music does not cover up a bad edit. Very often there are, I can see a few people laughing and nodding at this. It's just, there are a few podcasters I know, and they would basically say that they felt compelled to add music into a particular episode just to hide the fact that the person presenting was not particularly good at their job. Music doesn't cover that up. If you're not good at podcasting, you're going to be found out pretty quickly. Like, nobody would listen to you, surely. Nobody would engage. It also makes it quite a painful listening experience. If you're going to edit, try and at least do it well. That sounds really obnoxious to say, but there were so many podcasters that I've met, or people who wanted to podcast, and then they would mix all this horrible sound together, like music over the actual tape. Like, it was just painful. It's inaccessible and it makes it a nightmare to engage with. Why on earth would you even do that? It's just, try and keep it clean, please.
Okay, we like clean audio on this side. Are there any last little bits and pieces that haven't been asked, or little nuggets that you'd like to share before I wrap this up?
I was a guest on a podcast in November or December, and it was right after I'd moved. And I got a message that morning from the host saying, if you need to cancel, if you're not feeling up to it, if there's anything that you need, please let me know. And I think we've been talking about it as hosts, but I suppose for anyone who's listening who is a guest, or who has guests on shows, as has been mentioned a few times before, just really asking people what their access needs are, and making it clear that there are things that you can do to adapt. A lot of these things are actually very simple, and a lot of it just comes down to good communication. And it's just a little bit of forethought and a little bit of kindness can actually, that sounds really like wanky, but I guess it's true. it can go a long way in helping people feel like they can be part of something, and do the best job that they're coming on your show to do.
Do you know what? Kindness and consideration for others as well as ourselves is never wanky. Like we absolutely need more of that, not less. So thank you. Maya, any last nuggets?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. Communication is key. And I was recently interviewed for National Stuttering Awareness Week for a radio show here in San Francisco. And the reporter I was working with, she asked me, how would you like your speech represented? And would you like me to notate your stuttering explicitly? And the fact that she asked me that, I just felt, I've never been asked that before. And I just felt very seen and understood. And so just little things like that. Same thing along the lines of access needs, like that's a very specific access need. And that question is very specific to stuttering, but I think that there's questions like that that we can learn to ask to really make people feel more comfortable. And I know not every person who stutters would appreciate that question, but I think she was coming from a good place, and I had opened up to her about my stutter. And so those are just a few, that was just a recent experience I thought was very empowering for me.
Great, thank you so much for that, Maya. And I think, as with most things, just asking, like if you're not sure, I know with, let's say, name pronunciation, for example, ask somebody, it's like, oh, I've never come across this name before. Could I ask, how do I pronounce, or is there kind of like a name that you prefer if it's not your first name or your middle name, if it's a nickname? It's just getting to ensure that people are being represented in a way that's truest to them and most comfortable for them in that moment. And asking questions, like, it'll take you a long way. Communication does most of the work for you. Lydia, any last thoughts?
In terms of, I think everyone, and try not to be too controversial about this, this is going to get me criticized for saying this. I think sometimes people forget accessibility is not just a learnt thing. We are always learning about it. In terms of podcasting, I have been working to try and get transcripts in for the podcast, and I feel absolutely terrible that we've not done that. Physically, I can't right now. It's some days I struggle to get out of bed because of post-COVID stuff and in terms of everything else. But we are a very small team who work on multiple time zones, and all of us are disabled as well. I'm the only person who produces the podcast, and I just tell everybody else, okay, put this on social media and do this, basically. But accessibility, everyone sort of seems to do this thing where they just assume that it's learned, that we don't keep learning about it. I feel that I've learned a lot talking to everybody else here, for example. That makes me want to go and improve very quickly and very rapidly, because I know that I have done wrong in this. But I think that we need to be kind in terms of podcasting when it comes to this concept as well. We're trying our very best. It might not always be the best, but at least we're trying.
Can I follow on from that? We've talked a lot about kind of energy and finances with that. And I think this also comes to the point of who can make podcasts, because if people can't afford the help that they need or the support that they need in order to be able to produce a podcast, I know I wouldn't be putting a podcast out right now if I wasn't paying for producers. So if there are probably a lot of people with disabilities, with energy limiting chronic illness, who want to be able to put out podcasts, and either they don't have accessible tools to be able to do that, or they don't have the energy to be able to do it themselves. It's limiting who is able to participate in this industry. I just wanted to add that as a thing. I didn't have an elegant way to end that sentence.
And I'm done. No, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Natasha. And often, as with any new medium, there will be people that are left out, and given the experiences of those that have chronic illness, different conditions, disabilities, etc., it's usually us. Until things are changed, are adapted, and ideas and ideals change, within society. It's a long slog, but I'm sure the work that we all do within, our little circles of influence within the podcast world and elsewhere and otherwise definitely goes a long way to helping that. So thank you all so much for joining me today.